Thank you, Ian. This has been such an interesting journey to read some of William Carlos Williams, refamiliarize myself with them. And I love how he simply chose his words to indicate a specific thing that he saw. He's looking at something and goes, what are the best, simplest words and style to do this? And he felt compelled to do it. And it's very interesting as you look through his work. And a couple of the ones that I have for you here are just very short, sweet, simple, but they sum up a style and a part of life that he was compelled to look at, sometimes the smaller things. And this one is one of his more popular ones. It's one that's more familiar to some people. It says, "This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold." There it is. Another one is called The Red Wheelbarrow. And it has a lot of different levels to it, only it's very small. But if you really think about it, it goes a lot deeper. And it says, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens." Yeah, it makes you think about it because it sounds so simple, like a little kid verse or something at first, and then you think about what inspired him to do that and the deep thought that was involved with it.
The word glazed.
Yeah, yeah, and he chose his words so carefully to keep it concise. And then there's one called The Wood Thrush. "Fortunate man, it is not too late. The wood thrush flies into my garden. Before the snow, he looks at me silent without moving. His dappled breast reflecting tragic winter. Thoughts, my love, my own." So he sees a whole season in this little bird that flies into his garden. And I just think it's so cool. I love it. Love it, love it. I think it's hooked to him, but yeah, I'm very bad at projecting. Oh no, here's another one. It's called The Great Figure. "Among the rain and lights, I saw figure 5 in gold, unread, fire truck moving tense, unheated, to gong clangs, sirens howling, and wheels rumbling through the dark city." And that's just his take on watching an emergency vehicle. And it inspired a painting that's at the Museum of Modern Art. And I can't remember the artist that painted it. It was a contemporary of his. Are you bringing, it'll come up. Ian has that. Ian has that for later. So, okay, I got more for later. We'll do more.
Okay, so this brings us up to the point of him becoming involved with the others, and his very close relationships with the Imaginists, and these ongoing relationships that he had with Ford Madox Ford and D.H. Lawrence and Alyssa von Freiburg and Skipworth Cannell. These things would grow over time, and there would be salons dedicated specifically to spoken word and art simultaneously, which had never been done before. Paris claims its first school, but really this is happening in New York City in the 1920s. So in 1923, Spring and All is published, Go-Go is published, and The Great American Novel is published. At this point in time, The Great American Novel was probably his largest piece. And then in 1925, In the American Grain. These things would bring him critical acclaim of these specific works, and were challenged by the authorities at the time, who of course were the writers and founders of a previous school that we talked about, the men and women of the Algonquin Round Table, who founded two of America's greatest critical thinking magazines, The New Yorker and the Paris Review. And he would be held, he was actually held to an extraordinarily high standard, and he survived. And Dorothy Parker, as she had stated, and this is probably the only positive review that anybody ever received from her, I couldn't find anything wrong. He's a damn good man.
That's high praise.
So then he put together in 1928 an autobiographical travel log called The Voyage. And this was his first piece outside of, collected poems. I'm drawing a blank. Alexander Walcott, who was the travel editor for the New York, well, he was everything at one point in time. But he made a comment about this travel log, and he says, for a man who's never left Rutherford, New Jersey, which was a lie, he knows a great deal about a lot of things. I'll give it to him. And so this travel log became award-winning. 1931, he ends the collected poems. And he's planning on maybe publishing it. He's not quite sure. And 32, the novelette of other prose, The Knife and the Times of Other Stories. And then finally he makes a decision. He's going to publish it in 34. So he publishes his collected poems from 21 to 31. During this period of time, remember, he's still maintaining these relationships with great American artists, great European artists. He's going around to New York and San Francisco, and he's meeting more and more and more people. This was a man who never knew a stranger. And he could tell who was a great writer or a good writer and would inspire them to continue writing. And this is something that took him outside of the realm that he was in, because they were all a bunch of exclusive, at a certain point became so exclusive that they were untouchable. And we could talk about Man Ray or Amy Lowell, or, the list goes on. But he was willing to step out of the box. And you started to see it young in the 1930s. He completed his collected poems. He started the early modern and other poems. He completed and published in 36 Adam and Eve and the City. And he stopped for a minute and he said, I've got two stories going on in my head right now, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with them. So he wrote White Mule, which had eventually come to find out he had a sequel coming. And he was unaware of it. It was called In the Money. And then he starts to talk about history and why New Jersey is so gorgeous and why New Jersey is great and what is it about New Jersey that makes New Jersey, New Jersey. And this is his joke on it called The Little Passaic, talking about the river that runs through his town. In the 1940s, the 40s for him was a time where he only created two complete writings, The Wedge, and I don't have it written down. Something Span. That's the word I'm looking for. And he's sitting around and he's really thinking about Paterson, New Jersey, which is his hometown. And he wants to write an epic poem. And he wants to write a historic epic poem in a modernist flair. And so this is where he's beginning this. Broken Span, thank you. That was in 1941. And remember, his children are now entering into their secondary school, and I mean, there's a great deal of things going on in his personal life. But by 1946, he completes the Paterson book, #1, and now he says, okay, I'm going to go out, and he begins to see and seek younger generations of writers, and he really would like to influence the younger generation of writers. So he goes to these, he begins to travel all over the country. He first travels to San Francisco, and he meets up with Alan Watts, who was essentially the founder of the San Francisco Renaissance. And a whole slew of characters, Ralph Gleason, Kenneth Rexroth. I mean, these guys and gals, Madeline Gleason, these guys and gals are leaders in a new movement called American postmodernism, both in letters and in art. And Alan Watts says, you need to meet this guy. He's a little crazy. He's a good Jewish boy from New York. You need to meet him. So he goes to New York, and he meets Allen Ginsberg. And he says, you know what? And this is all part of that whole New York school. What is it that you can bring? And he sits around and he listens and he critiques them and he mentors them and he gives them money and he's participating, which is odd for his generation to participate with the new. And they were taking it all in. So then he goes to the Black Mountain School. And now, as I may not have stated this earlier, when he was at Horace Mann, while he was in Germany, he had met a really bright guy called Albert Einstein, just hanging around. And Albert Einstein just happened to be a very active member of this Black Mountain School, and lived in New Jersey, and was teaching at Princeton at the time. And so he became really interested in the science of science. How does science really work? And some of his writings, or some later writings, where you see how science is science, or at least to him. But at this point in time, he meets John Cage and Ed Dorn and David Tudor and de Kooning, the de Koonings, and he's being influenced by all of these. He's being influenced by all of these things, and all of these schools and groups are being influenced by him. And of course, last the Beat, meeting up with Allen Ginsberg. But the New York school, he becomes really good friends with James Schuller and Frank O'Hara, who give him a really bigger view. And I remember Frank O'Hara was the arts director for the Museum of Modern Art, and he was the one to first place Duchamp's toilet bowl, Dada's toilet bowl, in the center purview of the MoMA. So, and this is all in late 1940s, early 1950s, and he finally becomes real fast friends with Allen Ginsberg. He writes the collected later poems and writes another book called Make Light of It. And then in 51 continues book 2 of Patterson and another autobiography. And then in 52, the build-up. 53, confines himself to Hillside Hospital. Well, I went a little too fast, excuse me. Patterson's book 2, Patterson, at the end of him having it written, he succumbs to his first heart attack. And but while he's in the hospital recovering, he begins to write book 3, and has a series of 3 more heart attacks. So he's not extraordinarily healthy at this point in time. And in 1949, book 2 is published, and he completes Patterson book 3, and has his first series of strokes. And then in 51, completes book 3, and it's published. 52, the build-up, and then he realizes he's too tired, and Florence is sick, and his son is in medical school, and he's not getting any better, and he has a lot more to do. He confines himself to Hillside Hospital, in hopes that he gets better. At this point in time, Ginsberg and Burroughs visits him, and his quote, and the reason why we know about this quote is there was a fellow by the name of Yoshio Auchincloss who was visiting him who was a friend of his from the publishing world. And he just happened to be sitting there, and they said, "We can't believe that a nut house would let 2 nuts in." So, in 54, he writes Desert Music and Other Poems and Selected Essays. In 55, Journey to Love. And then he does something that he had never done before. He writes the opening and the introduction to Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems. Because he realized that this is the new generation. This beat is the place to be. New York School is the place to be. San Francisco is the place to be. And if we're going to modernize, let's create a new technique of doing this. Let's not close out the youth. And then in 57, he writes the selected letters of William Carlos Williams. These selected letters of William Carlos Williams are everything from the age of 6 to the time of just before the book was published. And in 58, he finalizes book 5 of Patterson. In late 58, early 59, he has his last stroke, which takes away his ability to have clear conversation, but he's still able to write. And he completes in 59, Yes, Mrs. Williams, a personal memoir of my mother. And he begins now to talk about his past, which was never a conversation. Never spoke of his father, never spoke of his grandfather. And when he spoke of his mother, he spoke of her as a woman who was dear and close, but that was it. So, is he edging towards death? We don't know. In 61, he completes Farmer's Daughter, and he's asked. he's asked by, this is 1962, he's asked by John Frank O'Hara to, would he be up to putting a drama together, a play, something in mutual, something together, something separate. And John O'Hara at the time was calling upon authors and writers to put together and essentially rebirth Broadway. Because remember, Broadway was dying at this particular point in time. So he puts together Many Loves and Other Plays. And that was written in 62. It wasn't performed until 1965. And then in 63, Pictures from Germany. And he dies at the age of 79, March 4th, 1963. And Patterson is completed. Books 1 through 5 are completed at the point in time. He's buried at Hillside Cemetery in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. I'm going to stop at this point in time. He has a great deal of legacy that we can talk about. Martha's going to come up and read a couple of things from that latter point of his life.
Tis Jean, this dream